In the past, there were only so many videos posted online, right?
Right.
Now everyone's posting thousands of videos every single day. And when the algorithm is deciding what it thinks you like, then now it becomes harder and harder for creators and artists to truly build an audience. In this era of algorithmic warfare is very, very, very difficult. We basically take your content and spread it across thousands of different surfaces to find the winners.
Hey, good to see you, Justin.
What's up? Second time on the podcast.
I know, right? Time flies. And I think it's been amazing to see your growth and development. And this is your second venture as well. So a lot to update, to talk about since then. So Justin, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, what's up? I'm Justin, CEO of Clouted, CEO and co-founder of Clouted. So we're the AI virality engine for brands, creators, and artists. Quick TLDR of everything. Started my whole journey in the startup scene in the gaming side of stuff. Back when I was 13 or 14, they called me a little child soldier in the whole grand scheme of things. Worked for a bunch of early stage companies, media outlets, and really spent most of my middle school and high school life in the gaming community. I eventually started my first company back in 2018. It was a platform for high school and college gamers called AcadArena. And honestly, that was a crazy experience, right? Basically juggling building a venture-backed startup while I was in high school and college. And ended up raising our seed, ended up raising our A, made all of the mistakes that a first-time founder would make, and ended up parting ways with the company pretty messily, honestly, back in 2023. Around then, I did a bunch of side quests, got into music, tried my hand at venture, and then eventually realized that there's nothing else I'd rather do than be doing cool things with my friends. So towards 2024, I decided to bring all my friends together, all the smartest friends I know, and we decided to do a new startup together called Clouted. But even Clouted itself wasn't necessarily smooth sailing at the start. We started off as a gaming company, and over the last couple of years, we've learned a lot. We've pivoted a fair bit after our pre-seed, eventually pivoted to the direction that we do now. And now we just raised our seed round, operate across Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and Manila. And we're figuring things out, but I think we're getting there.
Yeah, so much has changed over the past couple of years. And so, yeah, I think it's fascinating. And so check out the prior episode and we can talk more about that for your prior background. But I think after a couple of years or so, I have a little bit of a different prism as well. So from that perspective, Justin, maybe if you take a step back and you look back at yourself when you were being a founder, what drove you to be a founder in the first place back when you were in college?
I think at the end of the day, I think there's different types of founders, right? There's founders that are founders for the love of the game of startups. There's founders that do it because of some sort of event that they're trying to prove or baggage you're trying to get against. But I consider myself more of a missionary type of founder. I always tell people that if I wasn't working on something I didn't care about, I probably wouldn't be a founder.
Right.
And what drove me to be a founder the first time back in AcadArena was simply because I really believed that there was a massive opportunity lying in the college gaming space, right? It was a super underground scene at the time, but I saw just how much power there was in the community there. And as a promoter, as an events curator at heart, right? Building a company that brings people together or empowers communities is something that, especially the community I am part of or I'm passionate about, is something that really drove me to do it because I saw no one believed in it. I saw no one believed in college gaming at the time. Maybe they were right to not believe in it. It's just the space did not pan out. Maybe they were right not to believe in it. But at the time, it made sense, or at least the story made sense. And I decided to put all my eggs into platforming that space to the world.
Yeah.
And now with now with music, now with electronic music and the music and entertainment space in general, it's that's a space I've found a lot of passion in again. So I decided to spend the next stage of my life doing that too. So it's really communities and finding a community that I not only am a part of, but a community I want to grow and platform.
Yeah. And I think there's actually something that you really touched on, which was interesting, which is you believe in college gaming, and I too was a college gamer as well. And so I think there's a way to believe in it. That's one. And then two is you decided that you want a platform and there were critics of that space. And now you're kind of saying maybe there's some truth to what they said as well. Could you share a little bit more about that evolution to the gap between what you believe versus what the critics were saying versus what you eventually landed on is the right assessment of college gaming as a platform?
I mean, I like to think that in the vacuum that we were in the late 2010s and early 2020s, it could have actually worked as a venture scale business.
Right.
But as the paradigm shifted away from higher education, if you look at it, right, higher education enrollment is not only declining,
Right.
but also if you look at all this, college gaming was predicated on the fact that people were spending more and more time on campus, and being in school and being participating in like inter-school communities was one of the ways to like not only grow your professional and personal network, right?
Right.
That was like the thesis at the time. But if you look at the statistics now, at like, for example, my university, University of Washington, I was catching up with one of the student life people, and they were like, even though people are still enrolled, right? People are spending less and less time on campus,
Yeah.
right? Whether that is the, worse economy, meaning people have to have jobs, more jobs now in school, or people just finding less and less value in the collegiate system with the rise of like artificial intelligence and everything. It's like, I guess trends have shifted. And I always like to say, right, sometimes a thesis may be true or could have been truer back in a certain window of time or a vacuum. But nowadays, it isn't. That just isn't the case. And that's what kind of started leading to the decline of the college gaming space. But more so than that, right? I think because we were building in I would say like a secondary order effect industry,
Yeah.
in that it's like, not only are we contingent on the the status of the collegiate world, right, like the actual like scholastic world, but we're also contingent on how well the esports space is well performed, right? So when both macroeconomic factors or both macro fields are both in decline, because as we've seen, like esports is on decline as well, venture funding is down for it, then suddenly there's no economic tailwinds powering that space. So really at the time, it made sense at the time,
Right.
but nowadays it doesn't really. Yeah, and maybe if the world froze
Right.
at a certain point, right? If the world froze at that point when we raised their first round in 2021, then the thesis could have worked out.
Yeah. I agree with you actually, because back then, obviously, Overwatch was launching the esports league. There's a lot of money going in. People looked at it as the next football league or World Cup dynamic for esports. And it felt like everybody was on board for that thesis, and it seemed like it was growing. Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like it at the time, right? But then you start to realize where the value chain of esports is, right? Where ultimately esports is a marketing vehicle for a lot of the game publishers for the game, as it should be.
Right.
But at the end of the day, that means that when you're building a sport, you're building on a vehicle that someone else owns at the top.
Right.
And someone can change and control at any point, right? So
Right.
monetization was limited. You were basically at the beck and call of someone else's media property.
Right.
And with that in mind, right, if you are a brand where the majority of esports was getting its money from, where would you rather sponsor? Would you rather sponsor at the top, or would you rather sponsor from a derivative brand at the
Right.
bottom?
Yeah. I think that's such a important insight about industry market power, and the reality. I think it's honestly a masterclass for a lot of folks, because I think that's something that takes time to learn, and it's not easy to say, because at that point of time it was like esports, it's like soccer, it's like rugby, it's like cricket, but the reality is like cricket, nobody changes the rules of cricket.
You could. If you're on your own cricket
Yeah.
league, you could create your own rules, right?
Yeah.
But that's also the case, right? It's like in cricket, football, whatever, you could technically create your own league,
Yeah.
and no one would be like, there are some barriers between professional organizations,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
in other sports, you could still create your own derivative of the sport itself, and in turn, like monetize your own IP. But
Right.
in gaming, everything that you do has to be approved by the
Yeah.
publisher, has to be approved by the game developer.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you're playing in someone else's ball game.
Yeah.
And it's actually a very difficult investment to make, or it's a very difficult investment to underwrite when your entire enterprise value can be snapped away in a flick of a finger.
Yeah, like 10 step.
Yeah.
It's like, you know what? You've proven out a profit pool. Let me eat that.
Yeah, that's basically what happens to like a lot of like esports teams, right?
Yeah.
Like, especially let's say I am an esports team and I participate in the Valorant League right now, right? Riot has a rule right now where they can remove you if they see, like, obviously they have some like guardrails around it, but they can remove you as you see fit. Let's say you raised a $5 million seed round on, I have a spot in the Valorant League and among these others. Tomorrow Riot says, I don't like you, you're out, enterprise value is wiped.
Yeah.
Which is the case. There are specific startups that raised on the narrative of having these franchise slots, and then they got these franchise slots removed, and now suddenly investors are left holding the bag with a media IP that was built on someone else's media IP.
Yeah. I think in the end of the day, you end up being a sharecropper
Yeah.
on someone's larger property.
Exactly.
And maybe that's a decent living as a business, but may not be a venture scale business.
I mean, that's exactly what esports is in the state now, right? I do believe that there are going to be certain esports companies that are still going to hit venture scale. But then if you're a venture capitalist, right, or at anyone in like the startup world, you look to yourself when you see that the prize for winning in a space is so low and the amount of resources available in that space are too little too, then you end up with very, very few people left. And obviously those people are like the true believers, right? I think like Cloud9 is still going to exit. Those guys have great cash flow. But then every single thing that I call like non-primary esports, like derivatives, right? So esports tooling, esports like communities, like what we were doing at the collegiate side. If people at the primary side of the space already find it very, very difficult to find enterprise value, then everyone else below, like 1, 2, or 3 layers down is obviously gonna have an even worse time.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is that this is something that you've been learning over the past couple of years, both at AcadArena as well as in the early days of Clouted. But I'm just kind of curious that you said that Alc kind of ended messily and then you started exploring different things. Could you share a little bit more about that chapter?
Yeah. So I think that was like 2023, early 2024. I really didn't know what to do with my life, right? I was roaming around the world after I got kicked out from my last startup. I didn't know what I was going to do. So I decided like, hey, I spent the last 6 years of my life building the same thing in gaming. It's time for me to look at other spaces and see what I missed out on, right? I basically didn't have a normal college life because I was busy running a startup. I didn't really get to party. I didn't really get to like go out. I didn't really get to like experience other industries because I was so locked in on one individual thing. And when there's a lot of founders who actually like go through the same path if they drop out or if they do a startup early on in their like college lives, right? Where they're so one track and it doesn't really matter if you, it actually doesn't matter if you exit, right? But then when you don't exit, you realize that you're actually not a complete adult. You actually realize that there's a lot of perspectives in the world that you're lacking, right? Zuck never needed to be a complete adult because he exited Facebook. Good for him, right? But then suddenly I was there, 23 years old, never had a serious girlfriend at the time, never like went to a bunch of things, never really enjoyed, like never even had a real, worked in a real work environment outside of startups. So I decided to do the exact opposite of what I was doing and basically try to live every surface of life as I could. I basically traveled the world, went to a new country every week. I decided to pick up on a lot of like old hobbies and skills that I neglected, like cooking, among other things. I ended up, helping out part-time at a venture firm for a bit. Ended up, picking up music production and DJing. Basically, like trying to be a more complete adult before I turned 25. And that was like the core focus of my, I think like that was the core focus of like my like sprint from like 23 to 24 to 25, just being a more complete person and being a more complete adult. Because I told myself, right, if I ever did another startup, and I didn't think I would, but if I would do another startup, I would want to go into it as a more complete person, as a gift to myself moving forward.
Yeah. And I think that's when we also got to catch up during that time, during that sabbatical or travel period. And I think what struck me was that I think you had very high integrity around your journey to date. And also that you were, like I said, experimenting about all the different pieces. So we were discussing venture capital and different paths as well. I think what was interesting is that, here you are going through this deliberate structure experiments and then you decided to be a founder again. And I remember thinking to myself, now that's interesting. I wasn't surprised, but I think it was interesting. So I'm just kind of curious about why he said, hey, I want to be a founder again instead of the VC. Venture capital was path that was available to you. You could obviously have become an executive in an events or a gaming space. I'm just kind of curious how you landed on being founder.
Well, I was deciding between like 3 different life paths, right? Yeah. I think the thing with venture was that, I think I learned a lot in my time hanging around like the Outworks people. I think that was like a great time. But like what I saw there is that at the end of the day, I'm a very like impatient person. I'm trying to get better at that. I'm impatient to a degree or impatient to a fault in the sense that I do like being able to make my like large. I think one of my biggest things in the world, right, is I like having theses and being able to test them out and like being able to validate them very quickly. And I think the problem with myself in like the venture world, right, is that
it actually takes a very long time to prove if you're right in the venture world.
Yeah.
It's like, people can say they get their markups or like seed, Series A, whatever, but in order to be truly right, it's a very binary thing. It's to start exits or doesn't. So time horizon for you to prove if your thesis is correct is actually in the span of 5, maybe 6, 7, even 8 years, right? Maybe that's compressed in the era of AI, but you got my catch my drift in that, like, the time horizon to prove whether you're a good venture capitalist or not is much longer than it is if you are an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and ultimately, I set very clear boundaries or very clear time-gated expectations for myself every time I enter a new hobby, venture, or even a startup. Right? Like I always tell myself, I will try to get to these things by this time, or set clear like milestones for myself. Right? And I think the thing with venture is that it takes a very long time for yourself to be proven right or wrong in venture. And if I were to do venture, which I plan to do, at a certain point later in my life, it's something that I want to give the proper time commitment to for a specific thing. Because my original plan, right, was I was going to be a venture tourist, do 1 or 2 years, in venture, and then go back to startups. But then if I did that, I wouldn't be able to actually prove whether I was a good venture capitalist or not. Similarly to like my DJ career or like my, I guess like food arc before, I told myself for food, I'd get into MasterChef and I'd quit.
Yeah.
And then for DJing, I told myself within 2 years, I wanted to play at EDC in like Las Vegas. We're working on that one. So with venture, that kind of ruled venture out. And then when it came to like joining another like company, I think the challenge there was that the gaming space at the time didn't really at least in like Southeast Asia, right, where the majority of my network was, didn't really have a lot of like I guess like great companies that I could join and make an impact in. There were great companies that I couldn't join, or there were companies that I could make an impact in, but they weren't great companies.
Yeah.
Or they were great companies that I could join, but they weren't aligned with where I wanted to be, which was in the US, right? So it's like, at a certain point, you're like, if nothing really fits all my criteria, and I felt that like, I guess, phantom pain as a founder that had a messy like exit with his startup, right? Then I was like, fuck it, let's run it back with our friends again. Let's do things right this time. Because if there is even a piece of me that believes that I was in the right last time, then I can prove that right by doing it my way this time with the people that people said were the problem, and then let's run it back and do things like my way this time. And thankfully enough, I convinced some of my smartest friends, both from the previous startup and some of the people who were along for the journey, like Adriel, for example, to Adriel, my co-founder and your former colleague. We actually took Adriel away from you guys, but it's like we decided to convince a bunch of our friends to run it back and do another go at it, right? And I think that was ultimately actually the core of why that first iteration of Clouted didn't work out. Because at the end of the day, right, I like to say the first iteration of Clouted, Clout Kitchen, was a revenge startup, right? And that the core purpose of that startup was just to prove everyone wrong. But what drives me ultimately at the end of the day, and what drives a lot of the people on our team, is that we're missionaries. We're missionaries for a cause, right? That's why we sacrificed so many years of our life for collegiate esports, even though it was a seemingly impossible space. And while that like cause of like, there's a lot of cases of founders who do very, very well with like revenge startups, right? Like Parker from like Rippling. That was a very much a revenge startup. He took the exact same ideas, benefits, and then expanded upon it, and then decided to go on a revenge path, right? That worked for him. But for me, I like to think that my heart is best sustained by love and best sustained by care for people. And I think that's why the first version of Clouded, while we did go viral, we raised a couple rounds, it just didn't really feel right compared to like what we're doing now.
Yeah. So let's talk about the product market fit pivot. Yeah, and I think Adriel's also somebody who consulted me about this move as well. And he was an early contributor and co-host for Brave, as well as doing venture capital at a time with Orville Ventures and Non-Public. So I think what's interesting is that now you're going through this piece where you're thinking about revenge startup, which makes sense. I always tell people, it's like people are either revenge startups, rebound startups, or they're like a phoenix where they actually kind of like rebirth themselves. I think it's interesting because what you're sharing is that those stages, right? At the start, it was a revenge. And then you kind of rebirthed and pivoted. So what was that dynamic between the first stage of Clouted towards where it is today, that product market fit pivot?
Yeah, honestly, we started back in the gaming space again, right? We were like, what do we know best? It's gaming. What do we know best? It's like the whole like ed tech space, like, teaching people how to do stuff. And then what do we know best? It's like League of Legends. So at the time, it made sense. Let's bridge all these together and our relationships in the creator space, because ultimately, right, whether that is this version of Clouded or the previous version, which was like Clout Kitchen, right? I still shared a lot of similar beliefs about the creator space as a whole, in that there's a lot of like, at the end of the day, like all creators really want is for their craft to be seen to the world.
Right.
And I like to believe that when creators are able to focus on their craft and their craft alone, they're able to do a lot of great things. So that's why we started with the original version of what we did at Clouded, right? Which was like Backseat, where the idea was a lot of creators have latent audiences that they haven't really monetized, and a lot of their fans want more of their favorite creators, but creators don't have all the time in the world. They can't be everywhere. So what if we built AI companions based off the world's biggest creators that played games with the fans, right? The idea was that we had an unfair advantage because a lot of our team were pro league players. We were very good at like building like edtech stuff because of AcadArena. And then we had creator lines to help us expand there, right? That's why we sprinted towards it really, really quickly.
Right.
And then we launched, we went viral, hit like 1 million in like run rate really quickly as well. And yeah, it's like, I think one of the reasons why that ultimately failed, right, was even though we learned a lot in terms of like going up the value chain, right? Because previously, I think communities, while communities are powerful, communities are actually at the bottom of the value chain. So we moved up a ladder in the value chain into tooling, right?
Right.
But then we still fell into like a lot of similar pitfalls when it comes to like the gaming space still, where at the end of the day, right, in the gaming space, like if you're not the game or if you're not the platform, then you're basically sharecropping on someone else's land.
Yeah.
And we were, once again, right, just like how we were double sharecropping on the land of schools and the land of the game publishers, we were double sharecropping on the land of the game publishers and then the creators themselves too this time, right? So now we were building our business, like we just as much as we said we were building upon or learning from the mistakes that we had in the past, we made the same mistakes again to a degree with the first version of like Clouded, right? Obviously, execution-wise was way cleaner, way smoother than the first startup. But in terms of like core business fundamentals, right? Like a lot of the fundamental flaws were still there when it came to the business thesis. And more so than that, right? I think it's a couple of things. The first is that we realized that there was a lot of like power in the gaming and streaming space that was like being lost because like I get the cultural zeitgeist just moved towards other things. Most kids nowadays in the US, right? When you ask like a college kid, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, what do you do after school and on weekends? The main underground thing was college gaming events and LANs. Now that's at an all-time low. Now everyone in the US, what do you do in the weekends? People go to music festivals, especially after the pandemic, right? There was like a big rebound towards like real world activities. People are touching grass now. So the zeitgeist has moved, the cultural zeitgeist has moved, right? And when you're building a startup at the intersection of culture and technology, then you are subject or you are a victim or a benefactor of where the zeitgeist is, right? Same with AcadArena, we were very much a benefactor of like where the zeitgeist was. So that's the first piece. The second piece was, honestly, I just realized I kind of fell out of love with the whole gaming space, right? To be honest, everyone says it's like, and I believe this, maybe we could have probably made Backseat, maybe not as big of a venture scale outcome. Maybe we could have like gotten snapped up by one of the big gaming tools, among other things. There were many challenges when it came to like game publishers, right? But I'm sure we could have made something work.
Right.
But ultimately, when I talked to our board, right, on top of all the numerical and like objective reasons why it was time to pivot away from the gaming space, on top of the fact that running a 24/7 AI gaming companion was very, very expensive on AI credits, right? It was like it's up to this day, it still is very expensive to run a always on like companion. That's why there is no always on companion right now. If there was, it would be in mass market now, right? Yeah. So I think like I just told the board, like I don't think I'm as like, or rather my board director told me it's okay to be honest that you don't like this space anymore.
Right.
And I think there was just like a lot of baggage and a lot of like heartache in my heart and a lot of the team members too, when it came to like the gaming and like the streamer space at the time, to the point where, I'll still do business in that space, but I don't think I can commit my life's mission towards like furthering that space anymore, especially after it's caused me so much pain. So our board was like, then do what makes you happy and like be in a space where you're passionate about.
Yeah. I think you gave actually two really good insights. One is, people's passions change, right? I don't love the same things I did when I was in high school, for example, right? And so when your interests change, that's okay. And that happens for founders who are expected to commit 110%. And of course, the second thing that's really interesting is, I think there's a lot of truth to what you said, which is that sometimes the unit economics don't make sense for an always-on AI companion that also requires in a gaming inside, instant.
Yeah,
like latency has to be zero. You got to be immediate. Maybe in 10 years or 20 years, when the cost of credits and processing power gets even better, is on device, those numbers could fit with the mass market requirement.
We were doing some like cutting edge shit at the time, right?
Yeah.
We were trying to do on device like voice generation,
Right.
a bunch of other things, right? But at the end of the day, right, I think just the unit economics of like the gaming space, because everyone in gaming expects everything to be either cheap or free.
Yeah.
Because of how like the economics work there. But then also everyone also expects everything to be really, really good.
Yeah.
Right. But then venture capital expects you to grow 2x, like 3x, 3x, 2x, 2x. It's like, it was just fundamentally incompatible like economics because of how the gaming space has been conditioned by amazing free products, right? To the point where we were like, the only way this would happen is if we continued to get more AWS credits, right? We burned through like $200,000 of AWS credits in like 2 or 3 months while we were like popping off. And I was like, yeah, I think we're just setting money on fire in terms of this. And there was no way we could have kept growing it, right?
Yeah.
So we were like, yeah, let's pull the plug here.
Yeah.
And I could have kept fighting harder, right?
Yeah.
But I just don't think my heart was passionate about the space anymore. And that's the moment I realized, right, that despite like the revenge stuff, despite whatever, it's like, I don't think I can be driven by that. I think I'm just driven by being passionate about something. And that's just like, I applaud the founders who are driven by like a spite to prove people wrong, among other things. But for me, it's like, while I do have that part of me that does want to prove people wrong, I think I have to fundamentally really care or love something in order to commit time to it.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is that you're noticing and understanding that by yourself, and then you pivoted into virality and for creators and brands, which is adjacent but different as well. So what pulled you towards this current thesis? Yeah.
Well, I think like, one of the main things that I picked up during my sabbatical, right, was music and DJing, right? So I was told myself after Conquest, after everything that happened to AcadArena, I told myself I wouldn't ever do events again. But then I went to a music festival in Taiwan a couple years ago called S2O. Fun enough, ended up playing that one actually last weekend. So it was full circle. The festival that inspired me to live again was the festival I ended up playing in as well.
Yeah.
That was a crazy experience. But I think like going to that festival, and I went to a lot of other festivals during my sabbatical, made me fall in love with like the electronic music community, specifically like the rave scene, because of how welcoming it is. They didn't care where you come from or what you do, but it's also because all they care about is like you're there in like the moment, right? I fell in love with that community and it helped heal me. And more importantly, right, I think more so than like it being like my second home that helped heal me, I also recognized that the culture of Zeitgeist was moving towards here. Attendance at music festivals and like raves are going up higher and higher. And a lot of it is being driven by the fact that a lot of the people attending these events are up like middle to higher income individuals, right? So if you notice the trend of when you have a highly dense or highly focused group of passionate people that also have high spending power, then you're like, there's business to be done here, right? But more importantly, it's a cool community. It's an amazing space to be in. And I got into that space while I was in, I got into that space purely as a fan, then eventually as a DJ and as an artist myself, in terms of just like healing my inner child. And, one of the biggest problems I saw in this space, right, was a lot of artists tend to have to compromise or tend to have to do a lot of things in order to be discovered, because being discovered and seen in this era of, I call it like algorithmic warfare, is very, very, very difficult. When I started DJing, when I started like making music, it was very difficult for me to get my stuff seen out there.
Yeah.
And then I started to realize, right, a lot of the go-to-market or marketing motions of a DJ or a music artist or a creator or a brand or a startup are ultimately inherently similar. The CEO, the artist, the brand manager, they're all ultimately craftspeople at the end of the day, who are the stewards of their brand, right? And their biggest challenge isn't necessarily doing the thing, because if you are a great builder or craftsperson, you already have something great. Now it is like the biggest problem is getting it seen and getting it like spread across the world. And I myself, from my time at AcadArena, at Conquest, when it came to me running my own small electronic music events in the Philippines, just to like bring the scene back here, right? That's why we started And Friends. We wanted to bring that back here. I realized how difficult it was to get the word out there, because with Conquest and AcadArena, we had a platform of our existing community, everything. Then when I decided to do events again, starting fresh from everything, I no longer had that platform I did before to just boost anything that I did, right? So I had to rebuild my entire distribution base. And then I saw that was the same problem for a lot of my founder friends, the same problem for a lot of my like artist friends, specifically like my artist friends and people in the electronic space. So I was like, what if I just like remove that one distraction from them? And what if I was able to build product, I was able to build services that would help them remove the distraction of distribution so they could focus on their craft. And that is what led to us with like the current thesis of Clouted, right? Because last year, while we were still running Backseat, right? Or like the first version of Clout Kitchen, we decided to bring back like a gaming convention again, right? That was the first version of And Friends. And Friends was originally like 75% a gaming convention, 25% like a music event with like a Z after party. Then as we kept like marketing the event, we were like there isn't as much money in like the gaming scene anymore. We're not as passionate about the gaming stuff anymore. So funnily enough, if people think that like, because there's a lot of people that commented, right? I thought And Friends was a gaming convention. How did it suddenly, like people were like, how did it suddenly become a music festival? And then at the time, we told people that, what do you mean? It was always a music festival.
Yeah.
Like we actually like LARPed there a little bit, but actually we made a call in March, 2 months into the event marketing cycle and 2 months before the event, to actually pivot the entire event away from like gaming. So we actually kind of like, started trimming down the gaming stuff and then focusing more and more on the music stuff, because that was the only way the event was going to break even.
Yeah.
And that was also where like the money was like trending towards, right? But more so than that, at that point, our board was like, if you guys are going to do a music event or a primarily music event, then why don't you guys just become a music or like a company that benefits from this, right? So I was like, yeah, you know what? Why not? But at the time we were like, we didn't really know what to build in the music scene, right? Because we were still pivoting away from Backseat. We were still like experimenting a bunch of different products, among other things. But then I think the biggest thing is when you're building something to solve your own problems. So we were like, how do we market this music event more? How do we like get the word out more and more? And to that end, I started building out a bunch of tools. I started building out a bunch of like systems to basically like put the festival marketing on autopilot at scale. Basically a way for us to manage, validate, and pay out like hundreds of creators at once, following instructions, aka clipping, right? Among other things. And, we ended up selling out that festival last year thanks to a lot of the systems that we built. And all the artists that we were talking to were like, hey, Justin, it's really cool how you guys made the festival go viral. Could you do that for me? And then at that moment, I realized, hey, this is within Thesis. We're solving a problem for artists, creators, brands, people within like our network. B, it is a problem that I deeply care about, which is like being seen and being heard. And then C, we had, it's something that the team just genuinely feels passionate about. And from that point on, we dropped everything else we were doing at the time and decided to go all in on this current angle of solving the distribution problem.
So let's talk about solving the distribution problem, because I also resonate with the word like algorithmic warfare. Because one thing I do believe in is that time is finite and attention is also finite. There's only so many hours a day a person has a week. They only pay attention to one or two things at most at a time. And there's only a finite number of humans, right? So it's kind of a bit of a zero-sum game. Either you pay attention to your kids or you pay attention to Dungeons and Dragons, or you pay attention to a YouTube clip, but it's a zero-sum dynamic there. So what do you think is going on with this algorithmic warfare? Why is it so difficult for artists and everybody else to, get attention?
Yeah, because like obviously with like the rise of AI, right, and everything, not just the rise of AI, right, but in general, the trend over the last like 10 years, even before AI, right, is that the means of production and creation are only becoming easier and easier, right? So even before AI, right, like video editing tools were getting really, really good. like the rise of like the smartphone meant that anyone could shoot a video and like post online. Now, would those be good videos? Probably not. But the thing is that like the majority of these like people, right, or the majority of the feed is only going to get populated more and more. I call it like clipflation, right?
Yeah.
In the past, there were like, only so many videos posted online, right?
Right.
Now everyone's posting thousands of videos every single day.
Yeah.
So the way the old algorithms worked for like Facebook, Instagram, or whatever, right, was that your feed would basically be people that you follow, right?
Yeah.
It was a follower-based feed, so it was accumulated audiences. But as as the technology got better, as the means of production got easier and easier, feeds became more and more populated. And these platforms are also incentivized to try to keep you on these platforms for things that you might like, right?
Yeah.
So a platform shifted towards algorithmic feeds where rather than showing you stuff from people that you follow, they show you stuff from things that you might like based on who you follow and based on what you interact with.
Yeah.
And at that point, right, now it's becoming harder and harder for people to get discovered nowadays because it's not just about making sure people follow you, because even if they do follow you, there's no assurance that you're going to show up on their feed.
Yeah.
Now it's basically making sure that you not only have the ability to test and validate if the content that you're making on is something that people might enjoy, but it's also testing it at such a scale where every single time you put something out, you have a winner.
Right. I think it's just such a truth there because that shift from a follower-based system to an algorithmic-based system is basically a change from saying we respect who you choose to follow versus
What do you think?
we follow what you actually do or pay attention to, right? And so it's kind of an interesting choice of who you're following as a personality or who they're targeting as. Yeah, a little bit more like your primal brain rather than your prefrontal cortex.
But then when the algorithm is deciding what it thinks you like, then now it becomes harder and harder for creators and artists to truly build an audience.
Right.
And ultimately, that's why it's more important than ever to have what we call ways to do. I call it like algorithm penetration testing. This is like technically what we do at like Clouted, right? Where we basically take your content and spread it across thousands of different surfaces to find the winners.
Right. And so let's talk about maybe kind of like less about a problem, but more like how you actually go about doing it. Like what's special or unique, because there's lots of clip farms out there.
Yeah.
Right. It's putting out there. And there's clip farm marketplaces that also help put a two-sided marketplace between clippers versus brands and creators. So how do you approach things differently at Clouted?
Yeah. So ultimately, at the end of the day, right, how we operate is that everything is rooted in what we call like the brand soul or like the artist soul, and that when we work with a brand or when we work with one of our larger enterprise clients, obviously like one-off small clients like don't get that, but larger enterprise clients, how we work with them is that before we even craft a campaign, right, we ingest all of their data across all their different like surfaces, right? So Spotify for artists, Shopify, their socials, among other things, and basically construct a graph of like their entire brand, right? The choices that led them to get up to this point, the their competitors, the field they're around in, and basically use that to not only inform the kinds of campaigns we should be running, whether that is clip farm campaigns, UGC, fan accounts, among other things, in terms of like the content they should be doing and the content that they're producing, but also continuously feeding that back into each other so that there's like a self-learning loop there, right? And then how we differ from other clip farms is that rather than us just deploying to our own pool of supply, we actually believe in like the Uber and Airbnb thesis, right? Of like pooling different sources of supply. So while we have like our pool of like 20,000 plus like clippers out there, right? How our system works is that because we're operating at the budget owner layer, like it doesn't really matter to us if we're deploying that to our community or other communities.
Right.
We're actually spreading the budget where it works best too.
Yeah.
So we're actually, rather than us like thinking of ourselves as a clip farm, we see ourselves more as an evolution of a media buyer, right?
Yeah.
Like we're ultimately an AI media buyer. Like if you actually like ask for the boring definition of our company,
Right.
we're actually trying to be an AI media buyer, in that you give us your budget, and because we know you best, we know what works for you, what doesn't, and what fits your goals. We give us your goal, and then we spread that budget where we think it's best. And right now we're focusing on clip farming UGC because a lot of people want to go viral organically. But that's not to say that those are the only buckets that we'll be deploying your media spend to.
Yeah. On that note, just kind of curious, over the past couple of years, what would you say is a personal story about a time that you've been brave over the past couple of years since our last episode recording?
I think it's definitely pulling the plug on a startup that seemed like it was working, having the, courage or bravery to basically say, hey, we're almost at $1 million ARR right now. Like we just raised like a pre-seed round, had a lot of hype behind us, right? Being able to confidently say, let's pull the plug because I think that even though this train is moving fast, this train is going to hit a wall if we don't take the slow way around. Is something that a lot of people found crazy at the time. But I think if we weren't brave then and we didn't take the risk of resetting, then we wouldn't be here today at the fabulous Akada.
Yeah, fantastic. And maybe one deeper question is, what was scary or emotional about that process? Because I think you talk a lot about the logic and about that, but as a founder who's like wrapped up one company and so forth, what was the emotional process for you to go through that thought process? Yeah.
I think it was definitely like the signaling risk, right? Of people saying, oh, like you were wrong the first time and then now you're wrong the second time. Now you're pivoting around. And especially to go to like a space that people consider heavily like very unserious, like music, right? Was very much like the signaling risk there. So for me, I just tuned out of the noise and like decided to build my own way, build in peace, and then show everyone that like the thing that I believe in is something that has legs on it.
Yeah. On that note, great to hear. I'd love to summarize the 3 big takeaways. First, thanks for sharing about what was it like to wrap up your time at AcadArena and your, let's call it sabbatical or experiment phase. I thought there was a lot of self-reflection around being structured around your experiments, about what those new directions could be. I thought it was very helpful to hear about your various learnings from that time period. Secondly, thanks for sharing about your product market fit iterations. I thought it was just interesting to hear about how you said, I want to be a founder again with the team, but also going through the AI gaming space versus now an AI-powered media buyer, but looking at different industries like music versus gaming. I think there's a lot of truth between what you're seeing at the industry level. That's, I think, helpful for a lot of folks. Lastly, thanks for sharing about your founder journey. I thought it was just interesting to hear about your own self-reflection as your evolution on your own personal skills and understanding yourself. And I think that's very helpful because there's so many founders out there who are first-time founders who are discovering that for themselves versus those who have failed already and thinking through what those next steps could look like, versus even people who only see the hero stories but don't really see what the tough times really look like as a founder could be as well.
That's the slogan of our company, tough times in this economy.
On that note, let's wrap up and see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.